All right. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar. We're delighted to be doing this webinar at GPS. It's part of the Designing Policy for Global Impact series. And this webinar is on social policy and inequality in the US and abroad. My name is Alex Gelber. I'm a professor at UC San Diego of economics and policy. Much of my work has to do with issues relating to social policy and inequality, particularly in the US context. And as I'm sure we all know, these issues of inequality and the response of social policy are very much at the center of political debates and debates in the policy sphere these days and across really our whole society in the United States as well as many countries abroad. So this is really, I think, one of the central questions of our time. And so we're delighted to welcome three other panelists who are experts on these issues to our webinar today. So I'll introduce them. Dr. Emily Murase is a 1990 graduate of what was then called the UCSD Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, now GPS, School of Global Policy and Strategy. She's served as the director of the San Francisco Department on the Status of Women for over 15 years. And it is the only one of its kind in the nation. And since 1975, the department has focused on ending violence against women. Its signature initiative is the Gender-Based Violence Prevention and Intervention Grants Program. A co-founder of the San Francisco Collaborative Against Human Trafficking, Dr. Murase has pioneered strategies to address modern-day slavery. For her work, she'll receive the FBI Director's Community Leadership Award in Washington, D.C. in May. And before UCSD, she graduated from Bryn Mawr College and later earned her doctorate from Stanford. So that's our first distinguished panelist. Our second is a Master in Public Policy student at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and has been one of my students as well as John Ahlquist students, our third panelist, who I'll introduce in a second. So our second panelist is Camila Gómez. She has focused on social sustainability and particularly on the role that procurement decisions and supply chains can play in improving living conditions across the globe. After studying law in Colombia, Indonesia, and Seattle, she went on to work with young immigrants in the US. She returned to her native Colombia to work on capacity building projects with local grassroots organizations and later with the policy agency responsible for implementation of the economic development elements, particularly coca crop substitution of the peace accord signed with the FARC. Before coming to GPS, she did field work in East Africa to identify best practices in income generating initiatives in rural settings. And then our third panelist, last but not least, is John Ahlquist. John is an associate professor of political economy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. His work looks at how advanced capitalism and democratic government reinforce or undermine one another with a special focus on distributional conflict and the political mobilization of wage earners. His past research has appeared in numerous outlets, including the American Political Science Review and American Journal of Political Science. He's the author of 2 books published by Princeton University Press and Cambridge University Press, respectively. He holds a BA from Berkeley and a PhD from the University of Washington. We're delighted to have all 3 of these distinguished guests. So with that introduction, why don't we kick it off? Our guests, our fellow panelists have agreed kindly to put together some presentations on their areas of expertise. So I'd like to go in the order that I introduced the panelists. So we'll start with Dr. Murase, move to Camila Gómez, and then finally conclude with Professor Ahlquist.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. So excited to be part of today's webinar. As was introduced, I am a director of the I wrote to a status of women, and it is the strongest commission in the country. We have a full-time staff of 7 and operating budget of $10 million. Just to compare, New York City, population of 8 million, largest city in the United States. Mayor Bill de Blasio convened a gender equity commission for the first time a couple of years ago. Operating budget, $500,000 and a staff of 3. So this is for the largest city in the United States. The LA City Commission on the Status of Women, budget of 0 for the second largest city in the United States with a population of 4 million. So San Francisco has really made gender equity, women's issues a priority way back since 1975. So we do a lot of work in ending violence against women, and really at sort of the hyper local context, we have landed on the FBI's list of top 13 regions in the United States for child sex trafficking. Actually, San Diego is on that list as well, as is Los Angeles. It is a list that we do not want to be on. Of course, the first place that policymakers start is in the area of data. And so I just want to share where we land in terms of data. In 2015, we consulted 15 different sources, both government and nonprofits who serve trafficked victims. We surfaced 499 cases from those 15 sources. In 2016, we expanded the number of sources to 18 and surfaced 529 cases. And then finally, our most recent report, 2017, 673 cases from 22 sources. This is a quick slide showing that. It's important to note that these are cases and not individuals. So we know that there is duplication in these cases, but we also know that human trafficking is quite an underreported crime, and that this is just the tip of the iceberg. So just about those 673 cases in 2017, 77% were under the age of 25, 30% were under 18. According to the US Department of Justice, the average age for a sex trafficked young person, typically a girl, is 15 years old. As a parent of a teenager and a young adult, 15 years old is just really a terrible statistic. And 68% of the cases we surfaced involve female identified survivors. An important element in terms of social inequities, the issue has a disproportionate impact on particular ethnicities. So you can see from this slide, the largest number of trafficking cases involved African-American young people. 34%, 1 in 3 were African-American. Even though African-Americans only comprise 5% of the San Francisco population. We're about 884,000 formally. Of course, there are people that we miss in our census, but using that as a benchmark, 20% of cases involve Latinx folks, even though there's only 15% of the population who are Latinx, so there's disproportionality there. Then with Asian Pacific Islanders, San Francisco, 1 in 3 people are of Asian Pacific Islander descent. Only 20% of the cases reflected that. But I think that shows more of an underreporting problem than anything else. Whites are underrepresented in this area, multi-ethnic overrepresented, Native American, like we don't even have 1% of the population Native American, and yet the victims of this crime are 5% Native, which is really unfortunate, and it's something that we're trying to address. In terms of types of trafficking, we found that 54% involved commercial sex, 25% involved other industries, food service, construction, domestic work, 21% were unknown. There's a very large sample of unknown cases. So San Francisco responds. So what did we do? This was a very, very new issue. In 2009, we had our very first conference, just trying to figure out who was doing work in this area. And lo and behold, over 100 people showed up, all working in isolation of each other. So one tangible outcome of that convening was a social services directory of just who's doing work in this area. 1 year following that, in 2010, we launched the San Francisco Collaborative Against Human Trafficking with then Mayor Gavin Newsom, then District Attorney Camila Harris, who have now gone on to bigger things. But we started an annual awareness campaign. People just did not know about this issue. It's not just involving foreign women who are brought here to illegal brothels, but it involves a lot of teen runaways, LGBTQ kids who are kicked out of their home. It also involves domestic workers. So we've launched this annual awareness campaign. Then one of the biggest recommendations of SFCAT was that the San Francisco city government needed to have a formal body to respond to human trafficking. So in 2013, the mayor agreed to convene a task force against human trafficking. And then, so just to list a few policy responses as a result, in 2015, we spent 2 years trying to get all the city agencies and nonprofits on a single protocol on how to deal with trafficking cases, particularly when it came to young people, because we were sort of all over the place. We wanted to make sure that these young people were being responded to through the child welfare system and not the juvenile justice system. And so there is no such thing as a child prostitute. There is an assumption that any sex work by a minor is trafficking, it's coerced. So in 2015, we concluded a protocol among all the relevant agencies. And we realized that the response to youth trafficking was limited to Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. When are these young people recovered? It's typically not Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. It's usually late night, early morning on the weekend. So we worked for 2 years to get a 24/7 response, which is now provided by Huckleberry Youth Programs. And then in 2018, as a result of a youth advisory board and a youth committee that made recommendations about housing options for trafficked youth, we were able to secure a historic $9.3 million grant from the California Department of Social Services to really blow up the foster care system, because it turns out that foster kids are the primary target of exploiters, and that was a labor pool that they were tapping for this crime. So I just want to end with one example of policy making. So early on, we were confronted with a protest by sex workers. They had tape over their mouths because a really vigorous enforcement of anti-trafficking means eliminating their bread and butter, their vocation, their work. And so in typical San Francisco fashion, we brought them in. We have a very big tent approach, and we have a sex policy impact committee. And one thing we agree on is eliminating youth sex trafficking. But one concrete thing that we were able to get done, historic, was that sex workers get robbed and raped and abused, but when they would avail themselves of the police would arrest them for prostitution and not deal with the presenting victimhood that they faced. And so San Francisco, our commission, we don't have a formal policy on legalization, decriminalization of prostitution, but we do have a very strong position on violence against women, that every woman, whether they're in the construction trades or education or sex work, is entitled to public protection. So we work very closely with the police department, district attorney's office to create a prioritizing safety of sex workers policy that afforded them the opportunity to avail themselves of public safety services when they become victims of crime. And I'm very happy to say, as of last year, Governor Newsom made it a statewide policy to afford sex workers the same rights that everyone else enjoys in terms of public protection. So I'm just going to conclude with a slide on how you can help. To share. Everybody has a smartphone. Add the National Human Trafficking Hotline to your phone, 1-888-373-7888. You can also text help or info to their text line, Be Free. This is available 24/7. There are over 200 languages available. This crime is so invisible that it really boils down to a gut feeling, that you may see something, it doesn't feel right. One example is we had fruit vendors on street corners, and I thought it was a farmhand, like bringing produce up on a weekend to earn extra money. Turned out to be a whole human trafficking ring where they warehoused them in San Jose and didn't pay them, didn't give them breaks. They were responsible for bruised fruit. So you never know where these traffic victims may be. The second thing is you can take a slavery footprint of what your impact is in terms of supply chains that rely on slavery. And then finally, to volunteer with or donate to an organization that works with trafficking victims. And just in terms of resources, this is the department website. I recommend San Francisco Collaborative Against Human Trafficking. And then of course, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That website has a lot of statistics broken down by state and community. I recommend it. So looking forward to a robust discussion. Alex, you're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murase. That is very important work that you've described, and we'll have a chance to discuss that work and come back, have a discussion among all the panelists, as well as take questions from the audience at the end. If you have questions, I believe there's a chat bar where you can put those questions in, and so we can call those questions together and come back to some of them at the end. So now let's move on to Camila Gómez-Wills, who will talk about some of her research.
Hello, everyone. After Dr. Murase's, as she mentioned, hyper-local presentation on San Francisco, what I'm going to do is actually zoom out and talk about this from kind of a global arena standpoint. So I have some slides here to share. Bear with me one moment. Okay. And then you should be seeing what I'm seeing. If you could nod affirmatively, that'd be great. Yes, okay, super. So overall, we thought that this would be a great example of how inequality operates today with products that we use every single day. So to begin with, there's kind of three elements in today's context that really help explain what it is that's going on and how it is that supply chains are an important area where modern slavery or human trafficking can happen. And the first one of them is globalization and the fact that this leads to very interdependent economies that are not necessarily on equal standing. And this goes hand in hand with our second element, which is what we're going to call the unbundling of production. So basically an item that we're all using here today, let's use the computer, which is the same example I'm going to rely on later on. This computer has components that were potentially mined in one country, smelted in another, et cetera. And there's not only inequality within those countries that serve to produce these goods, but also inequality between the producing countries and the buying countries. And then the first way that inequality shows up is this really interesting and growingly complex interplay between our traditional state unit of enforcement and then corporate governance structures that are becoming more and more prominent. So we have companies, massive companies with very large budgets that sometimes are larger than even the entire budgets of the countries where they operate, having codes of conduct that sometimes clash either because they exceed or they're below what local regulations or international conventions that countries are signatories would require. So all in all, these three elements is kind of what I'm going to ask you to hold, take into account as we discuss this example of supply chains in tech, and consider that this unbundling of production is also driven by seeking lower costs. So it's not that people are doing this just because, we're looking for the cheapest cost of production to be able to capture profits that will then be redistributed maybe, but within very local context. So for example, the shareholders of the corporation, but they won't necessarily go all the way down to where the low costs were actually taken advantage of, so to speak. And then the kind of last corollary of this is that we need to consider within this kind of broader realm of corporate governance is that many of the times the companies have codes of conduct that affect only their direct suppliers. So anything beyond, subcontracted beyond their direct supplier is actually completely outside the scope or enforcement liability, et cetera, of the original buyer that is in theory demanding that their goods be made without forced labor, child labor, et cetera. So this adds an additional layer of complexity, and that's what's called tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers. And we're starting to see more and more efforts on how to bring those tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers in line. So now on to our example for electronics. So this is just a great kind of poster child for all the elements we just discussed. So first of all, it's really complex supply chain that involves transforming raw materials into very high cost, value added goods that there's continuous demand for. I mean, we're all watching this webinar on a computer and there's no indication that our demand for technology is going to decrease. So I'm seeing the chat here. Just want to make sure that this isn't, oh. Are you guys seeing the slide of flow of goods? Huh, I see, interesting. Sorry, give me 1 second. Looks like we're not seeing the same thing. Just one moment here. Okay. Huh. I'll just stop share and start again and see if this works. Okay, share. Okay, and then maybe it is that when so let's see if this works. Can you nod if you see my slides changing? No. Okay, so I'm just gonna do it like this. Right now you see all the same slides, we're seeing a context slide. Okay, I'm just gonna do it like this. It looks like the presentation mode doesn't slide through actually. through the slides. So going back to our flow of goods example. So we have raw materials in general sourced from what we call the Great Lakes region in kind of the Central African area around the DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, etc. Or in the case of, say, electric vehicles, we have what's called the lithium triangle in between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, which raises a lot of other kind of geopolitical considerations between those countries. But basically, we have these raw materials from these countries, which are then transported to be smelted into a different location that's usually international. So that involves risks of abuse there, and then also to assembly. And the majority of our electronics today are either assembled in Malaysia or China. And one of the huge risks that's been identified here is the use of migrant labor in exploitative ways. One of the ways that this shows up is through recruitment fees. So instead of it being, hey, I'm going to apply for this job, and then if I get it, great, I will be paid for the work I do, which is kind of in our, let's say, traditional naive framework, that's how a job search should go. This is, I'm going to apply for a job and I'm going to pay the recruiter up to 3-4 years worth of my salary for the favor, opportunity, etc., to be given a job in which I will work for to pay my debt and eventually be able to send money back home. And often this is done with retention of documents involved or with other ways of limiting movement. So they can't leave the factory floor, they sleep in the factory, they can't communicate with outsiders, they often don't even speak the language. So there's a sense of vulnerability with migrant workers that we really need to consider when having these discussions. And then the other kind of locus of inequality that comes here is the minimum wage. So who would be responsible for enforcing the minimum wages of these countries, and are they being able to do so? And as far as we can tell, it looks like we have not been able to successfully enforce minimum wages in these very kind of low capacity global south regions of production, which also calls into question kind of this third element that we were talking about before of the differing hierarchies between local legislation and corporate codes of conduct, and how maybe corporate codes of conduct and local legislation would require them to pay a minimum wage, but this is actually not playing out in practice. And then we have an end consumer, so us, right? We're sitting in the US, in Europe, in South America, anywhere really. And often we will start to demand more transparency from the brands we buy from. But what do we really mean when we're demanding transparency, and what do we expect from those brands? And how can a brand make good, let's say, on this call for better practices in their supply chains? Up to where is the brand really accountable, responsible, or liable? And this plays, as we were saying, with the subcontracting. And maybe the brand does audits, but they only audit their direct suppliers and not anyone that was subcontracted by their suppliers. Or maybe the audits don't actually capture the information in a kind of truthful, accurate manner. And there's a lot of research being done right now on how audits are or aren't effective in producing change in global supply chains and improving working conditions. And although there's kind of concluding in both directions, overall there is a push to go beyond auditing and to move towards these due diligence legislations that we're starting to see in the European Union mainly. And then the final phase of this kind of life cycle of our electronics is post-consumer. So what happens when our phone, we don't want to use it anymore, either it doesn't work, it cracked its screen, it's completely irrecoverable. We then go again to see these kind of very specific forms of inequality in which the phones, the actual devices, are taken back to the global south to be disassembled and to try and strip the raw minerals which are still worth something. So what I think is really crucial, I mean, also considering the context of this webinar, is what are the policy challenges with this kind of transnational global problem? So first of all, there's conflicting interests, right? So the government is mainly interested in being attractive for foreign investment, right? Maybe having job creation, capital flows into their country. And how does that play into actually enforcing these regulatory requirements? And or even if they did have the intent to do so, do they have the capacity and do they actually fund these initiatives? As Dr. Murase was saying, if you're gonna fund human trafficking efforts in the city of New York, it sounds like you're gonna need much more than what they're actually funding right now. And then the second interest that comes into play here is the firm interest, right? All they want, or not all they want, but one of the things that they want is to have a stable sourcing partner that will provide them with some form of cost and risk mitigation. Nobody wants to hear right before their delivery of their Christmas season that the supplier wasn't able to meet the orders and that they're going to have to look for someone else that is able to deliver on time and within the technical specifications. So if that's the primary intent of the supplier, we can see how really the worker is not really necessarily considered in this equation. And then the manufacturer's interest is really just sustaining their future orders. So they need to deliver on time, deliver within the price that they said, and potentially pass these audits. The worker, at its turn, is looking for a stable source of income. So all these players and stakeholders in our supply chains are primarily not on equal ground, and they are also not capable of pushing their own agendas and their own interests in the same way as others are. And this really puts us policymakers in kind of a difficult situation on how to balance these different things when we're trying to serve the interest of the workers down the supply chain, which don't get to see the profits that are being captured elsewhere. And then just to close it off, I did want to discuss a little bit kind of what we're seeing in the current trends in what we're going to call the global north versus kind of a more structural problem. And it's that we're really pushing for transparency and due diligence. The UK's Modern Slavery Act, Australia has a similar one, California has transparency requirements that are very specific. France has new due diligence legislation, and all these pushes are great, and they may be a path forward. And we also see shareholder pressures. So proxy voting statements, we recently saw major hedge fund managers saying that they're going to start considering more climate change, and there's similar pushes in the human rights arena. But really, at the end of the day, there's the persistence of underserved populations in these very low capacity contexts that are vulnerable to being exploited in these conditions that we actually continue to buy products from. So we have this kind of policy push on one channel or going on one track, while we continue to have people that are vulnerable to continuing to being exploited. I think I'm going to leave it at that, and then we'll kind of touch base again with the rest of the conversation later on.
Great. Thank you very much, Camila. Those are very interesting issues, and we look forward to returning to them later. Professor Ahlquist, it's your turn to close things off in terms of our presentations.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Dr. Murase and Camila, and to the audience for giving us a chance to share some of our thoughts and engage. So as Alex mentioned, I'm John Ahlquist. I'm faculty here at GPS. And with the brief time that I have this morning, I'm going to, in some sense, split the difference between the global supply chain approach that Camila was taking and the hyper-local initiatives that Dr. Murase was talking about. I think the poster I saw for this webinar said, "Inequality in social policy, can we do better?" ? And I think what we've already heard in the first two presentations is a little bit about some of the needs and challenges in the form of global supply chains, but then also some of the very concrete steps that are being taken in very hyper-focused geographic and policy areas in the form of human trafficking in San Francisco from Dr. Murase. So I'm going to start talking about how we might think about doing better, or what is it going to require for us to build in order for us to understand the situation we may find ourselves in the United States, and then to actually think long-term and critically about how to do better, in fact. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about work and employment relations And in particular, this thing called social insurance, which is or social policy, which is in the title of the webinar. Just so we're all kind of on the same page here, what we're talking about here is really the set of regulations and programs and typically government initiatives, although there may be private sector involvement and NGO involvement, around a set of involvements or interventions that are designed to prevent people from effectively falling into destitution simply from the common predictable risks that we all share and face. And these include things like a lost job, but also injury on the job, and then ultimately up to and including aging. So historically speaking, unemployment insurance was the foundational social insurance policy, and one that I think pretty much everyone is familiar with, either directly and personally or in general. And policy discussions around unemployment insurance and other types of labor market interventions are often framed in terms of some sort of efficiency versus equity trade-off, or helping the bottom at the expense of those at the top, or trade-offs of this kind. And that can be helpful in certain circumstances, but I think it's not entirely clear that that's going to be the most useful approach going forward. So let me just give you an example, and hopefully this in fact actually does shift. Do you see graphs? Great. So these are just some off-the-shelf data that I'm playing with for another project, and all this is reporting here is on the horizontal axis, basically the generosity of the unemployment insurance system in a variety of advanced and developing countries. And that's called the net replacement rate is the technical term for that. And on the vertical axis on these two plots are various indices or indicators of involvement or health or breadth of the paid labor force, the paid labor market. So there's the employment rate on your left, and there is the unemployment rate on the right. And what you'll see, contra to any claim that generous unemployment insurance is going to necessarily and always hamper the development of new jobs and getting people into the labor market, what we see here is, if anything, a weak and positive relationship between unemployment insurance generosity and participation in the labor market. And that's not to say this is necessarily causal, but it's a way of highlighting the fact that this dichotomy is not necessarily the way we need to proceed. So I think there's an even more interesting claim that has been floating around for some time, and that's one that I think really gets us into the heart of what we're thinking about in the transformations we're seeing in advanced capitalist economies and labor markets. And that's this notion of skills, upskilling, the transformation of work, the need to continually learn as you go through your working life to adapt to new tools and technologies. And in particular, this argument has been around, has really been talking about the structure of social insurance policies and the willingness of workers and firms to both invest in what are called relationship-specific assets. And that is to say, production processes and technology and capital from the firm side, and skills and abilities from the worker side that are hyper-specific to that production process for a particular product or just for that firm, or maybe in an industry, but these things that really require both sides of the labor market to, in some sense, trust and rely on one another, because they're both setting themselves up for the possibility of holdup and exploitation. So the argument goes something like this, that there are these production processes and technologies that a firm might want to use, but to do so effectively, they need to have workers that are capable and have invested in very specific skills that are only valuable in a particular employment context. The workers, on the other hand, know this, and they're reluctant to take the risk of making this investment, because whatever promises the firm might try to make ahead of time to get them to make this investment turn out to not be credible once the workers have actually gone out and made these investments, or the firm is not in the position to deliver on any promises if there's a recession or the firm goes out of business or something else. So the argument says that more generous unemployment insurance and related policies can actually step in here and lubricate or provide the credible commitment mechanism in this problem such that workers actually will be more willing to invest in firm-specific skills and training, which in turn allows firms themselves to be more willing to take the risk of developing new technologies and processes that rely on those types of skills. So that's an interesting argument that kind of goes beyond this simple equity efficiency trade-off. And so a collaborator of mine and I are interested in testing this argument. Does it actually behaviorally play out? And so what you're seeing now is the results of a series of laboratory experiments that he and I have been doing. And they're admittedly quite contrived. They aren't necessarily reflective of a real job or firm, but they do allow us a lot of control, where we can actually control the tasks people are doing and the level of generosity of the unemployment and social policies they're facing. And what we find, in fact, is that more generous unemployment insurance policies do, in fact, produce greater willingness to invest in these risky skills. So where does that then leave us going forward? And I think what it does is holds up some opportunities, but also some of the challenges. So the policies we have in place, particularly in the United States around social insurance, can really be, we can credit the greatest generation, if you will, the people coming of age in the Depression and the World War II period, and their kind of parents as the folks who devised and implemented the first wave of these policies in the 1940s and afterwards. But that also means that access to these policies, access to unemployment insurance, access to healthcare, access to job protections are really bound up in a 1940s vision of a job and a labor market contract and a household. And this matters because how we count or what counts as a job and how well you can access the social safety net depends on the definition of a labor contract. And we can tell that what it means to have a job or go to work is in fact changing. And the risks that people are facing in the labor markets appear to be accelerating and taking new and different forms. The challenge we have, and this is where we need help to do better, is that we don't have necessarily a good handle on exactly how and where and how quickly these changes are happening. So let me give you an example that you're seeing in front of you. And this is just a screen grab from an online platform that you may have heard of if you play video games, and it's called Twitch. I myself am not a gamer, but it turns out Twitch, depending on the day and the time, is one of the biggest users of bandwidth in the world. And what you see in the bottom right is a woman who is, in this context, called a broadcaster. And she is playing this particular video game in real time and streaming her play of that game to whoever wants to come and hang out and watch her play, not dissimilar to this exact webinar. What she's doing different is that the people who are watching you can see on the side in that kind of chat frame, can actually send her money and other types of stuff. And a relatively small number of people can actually make a really good living as a Twitch broadcaster. So the question is what she's doing here, is this a job? And is her ability to generate an audience and play this game in a way that keeps people engaged, is that a skill? But moreover, this broadcaster does not have any access to anything like a minimum wage protection. It's not even clear what a minimum wage would mean here. If the game she's spent time and energy becoming good at suddenly isn't popular, or the economy goes into a recession and people are less willing to send money to people playing video games online, her income dries up and she risks falling through the cracks of our existing social insurance systems. But we are not in a position to actually track what and how much this is going on across the economy. So I'm involved in a series of projects that are really trying to rethink our data infrastructure around work and labor and the labor market in order to allow us to develop policies and in fact do better, to renovate our social safety net and our social insurance policies for the new labor market that we're facing today, to let both firms and workers take advantage of these new opportunities, but in ways that they don't fall through the cracks, and in ways that our policies actually do in fact reflect. So in other words, our widely accessible and reliable public data are good, but they're not what we need to make new policy and update our existing policies. So let me explain to you some of the challenges. First off, an obvious one is disinvestment. So federal investment in our statistical agencies in 2017 was down roughly 10% from its average between 2004 and 2013, notwithstanding the fact that the labor market has grown substantially since then. The cost of things like the census or our standard labor market surveys are rapidly mounting, response rates are dropping, and the questions we're asking, although valuable, don't necessarily reflect what's going on in the world today. And this old way of gathering data is very top-down, very observational, and requires people to go out and knock on doors and so forth. What I'm in the process of working on with some collaborators around the world is ways of thinking about how we might develop a more bottom-up data infrastructure. And the analogy we're using is one to weather stations and our weather data infrastructure, where you have a combination of publicly funded large-scale infrastructure projects like satellites, like weather buoys, like balloons, and a variety of other data gathering things, alongside private data that are then ingested into a whole public data infrastructure that then produces all of the products that we're familiar with when it comes to weather forecasting and climate tracking. Is there a way to use a process similar to that to gather data from our existing public data infrastructure alongside things like digital trace data, data gathered from platforms that are managing various labor markets, from hiring and contracting and job search platforms like LinkedIn and others? Can we combine some of these data in ways that can let us track what's happening in closer to real time in a bottom-up participatory way that it also retains privacy protections and data security? And that's a tall order that's going to require a lot of work and a lot of commitment from a variety of different actors. And so that's one thing that I'm in the midst of right now, and something that I can, if any of the audience members have suggestions or opportunities, I'm excited to hear them, but I can also answer questions about what this might require. So let me just quickly say a couple words about how we're actually making, what are we actually doing right now to make this move forward. And we just recently convened a workshop, thanks to the Yankelovich Center here at UCSD, where we're gathering a whole bunch of people who have been doing the really deep dive interviews and long-term conversations with Americans of various different income levels in all different geographic settings, and hearing the stories they're telling about their income, how they make an income, how secure it is, what it takes, the level of unpaid work they have to do to get an hour of paid work, and how do you leverage this deep interview data that we're getting from survey projects, from anthropologists and from ethnographers, alongside our bigger and more robust standard data infrastructure? Can we use these two things to find out exactly what our existing data are missing to inform how we can improve our data infrastructure and maybe even start improving our policies? So with that, I'll stop, but I'm excited to hear more from the panelists and also from the audience.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Ahlquist, and thanks to all of the panelists for a very stimulating set of observations. So I will kick it off with one question for the panelists, and then either continue asking questions, or if there are questions from the audience, we'll turn it over to audience questions. So, so to all the panelists, I'm curious about the role of policy here. You all mentioned policy, obviously, it's part and parcel of your presentations. But I'm curious, what are the most important policy levers that you would look to change? If you could wave a magic wand, what's the single most important feasible policy lever that you would press? And so in Professor Ahlquist's case, maybe that relates to some of the data issues you're talking about, or with respect to the UI issues. In Camila's case, you mentioned some transparency and due diligence legislation, issues relating to proxy and voting statements, maybe other issues. In Dr. Murase's case, I will also invite you, to take a pass on the question if that's not something that you can address as a sitting policymaker, to speak on behalf of your organization. So I understand that. But in any case, I'm interested in all of your thoughts on that common theme of what are the lowest hanging fruits in terms of policy.
I can start. So I just want to raise two issues. we as the Department of Status of Women focus on victimhood. And really, we don't do a lot of work in terms of the perpetrators. So in terms of policy prescriptions, other communities have been very aggressive on the demand side of human trafficking. For example, Alameda County District Attorney Nancy O'Malley sends a letter home to the license plate owners who drive up and down International Boulevard, which is the track where there's a lot of child sex trafficking. So these letters go home. Who opens the mail? It's usually the wife. And the letter simply says, you know, we saw a car with this license plate on International Boulevard. We just want you to know that it's a high intensity area for child sex trafficking, and you might want to think twice about activities on that boulevard. So we don't do that here in San Francisco because of the sex worker concerns. But that is a policy lever that I would love to see globally, a focus on perpetrators. And the second policy issue that I posed to people in the audience is we had a raging debate at our mayor's task force on whether to support or oppose the federal takedown of websites that advertise for commercial sex. So the feds actually did take down Backpage, Redbook, a lot of websites, platforms that allowed sex workers and trafficked women, pimps, to make deals. So in our task force, we have quite a range of opinion from the modern day abolitionists, zero tolerance for any kind of sex work, to actual sex workers. And it boiled down to winners and losers. So by taking down these websites, there will be no more exploitation of 4-year-olds or 6-year-olds, or really the most deviant part of commercial sex exploitation, because you can't have that kind of marketplace on the street. But by shutting it down, you don't have a blueprint for enforcement, and these adult women are forced into the streets. And we are now grappling with a spike in street prostitution, in crime, in victimhood of sex workers. So it was a really tough call, but with the voice of law enforcement actually saying, we no longer have that blueprint for enforcement, our task force came out opposed to the federal takedown of these websites.
Great. Why don't we move in order of the presenters? Camila, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Sure. I like how you limited it to low-hanging fruit and feasibility, because my mind was going in all kinds of directions, but now it's much more focused. I'd say, first of all, I think it's really important to shift the discourse policy-wide from a name and blame situation to more developing a sense of agency around it. Because I think part of what's happening right now is we're calling on government agencies to enforce. And that's great. We do have the rules that need to be enforced to do that. But I think we also need to start moving beyond that. And it's okay, when these cases are found, what is it that we expect these brand buyers, manufacturers, et cetera, to do with them? And I think right now that's where we're kind of limping a little bit, in that if you don't find it, it means you're not looking for it. It doesn't mean that it's not there. So I think we need to encourage looking for it and provide kind of action steps for once it's found. And then the other one is kind of homogeneous data methodologies for collecting cases of prevalence and incidents across the globe. And right now it's really, really hard. So there's a centralized data set right now that is trying to bring together information with the ILO and with the Polaris project, but it adds up to about 50 countries and 10 years. And there's very little publicly available sources of information that really allow for comparative work to be done on the prevalence of human trafficking.
Great. So yeah, the low-hanging fruit is always it's tough, because if it's actually in fact low-hanging, you would assume it would be picked already. But I have a few thoughts on that, and then a couple of them that refer back to the platform-mediated labor in general, and then how that's manifested with sex workers in particular. So the single, I think, it's not easy, but most straightforward thing that would be a way to improve the kind of social safety net in the United States would simply be enforcement of what we have. So one of the more interesting things with the push for increasing minimum wages around the country, which have been extraordinarily successful politically, is people are very supportive of increasing the statutory minimum wage, perhaps expanding the set of workers to whom it would apply. But relatively few, if any, of those initiatives, whether they come through citizen referenda or legislative action, include a budget for enforcement. And we're seeing both certainly at the federal level in a variety of states, a lack of enforcement of existing or new attempts to improve our social insurance policies in the more traditional format. So that's one, I think, easy to understand, if not necessarily easy to secure things that could be done. I think slightly more forward-looking things that have already been put out there that I think would be certainly worth experimentation, if not actual pursuit, is one of them is things like not tying a variety of extremely important benefits to any one particular labor contract. And I think the most egregious of that is healthcare. So whether it's portable benefits or portable healthcare, or the ability to access affordable services of that sort in ways that aren't tied to one job or a W-2 employment status, I think is slightly more ambitious, but an idea that's been around for a while that I think is certainly feasible. Alongside that, and this relates to California's AB5, which is currently a big area of dispute, which is how do you classify workers? Are they an employee or an independent contractor? I think AB5 is certainly well-intentioned, but I think ultimately it's a missed opportunity in the sense that it's trying to, rather than respond to opportunities and renovate our social insurance and social welfare infrastructure, it's trying to force things back into a 1940s way of thinking about a job contract. And there are alternative suggestions out there about expanding the types of worker classifications to have hybrid versions that are between independent contractors and standard wage and salary employees that provide some of the services and benefits you expect from ongoing employment, but also recognize the challenges and opportunities of new types of labor contracting. So those are three. A more long-term one that directly speaks to this data problem is I think ultimately there's going to be a lot of data that resides in platforms and other businesses that are going to be needed to build and sustain a verifiable public data infrastructure. And I think ultimately there's going to have to be something like a data tax that requires entities to provide anonymized or other forms of information to something like the Census Bureau in a way to improve and sustain our data. But that's a long way off, obviously. But it does go back to this broader notion of platform-mediated work and the challenge with, do you shut down the platform, as was the case, or at least that's what was attempted in the case of sex work, in order to prevent some of the negative externalities that's associated with sex work, including sex trafficking. And it seems like the consensus is emerging that this hasn't been a terribly successful strategy. It's not clear that it's necessarily dampened sex trafficking. I know Dr. Murase mentioned that you can't have these extreme and clearly quite objectionable forms of sex trafficking if you shut down these platforms. And that's not obvious to me. What is obvious to me is that it's way, way harder to see it and find it, which might in fact be a benefit to know its scale and location, even if its visibility has other negative consequences. And then leaving aside the other things. So the big missing piece here in terms of that would help us shut down or remove the kind of illicit or objectionable markets while allowing other ones to perhaps function more safely will require some sort of verifiable online identification that sex workers or any type of worker could use online to prove their identity and to track their income and to ultimately hopefully get access to the protections and services we've already established as desirable and necessary in a fair market economy.
Great. Well, thank you very much for all of your thoughts on that. I was thinking that we would have time for audience questions. It turns out we don't have time for audience questions, but we also don't have any audience questions. So that fits together quite well. But we thank our audience very much for participating, for being interested in these important issues. And thanks also, very importantly, to our panelists for making the time today, for preparing their presentations, and for their very valuable thoughts on these central policy issues. So thank you very much to all for participating in this policy series. And I know there are other webinars planned for this policy series. So, we hope that some of the audience at least will be able to participate moving forward. Have a great day, and thanks so much again for participating.
Thank you.